in modernist painting, people became so obsessed with the brush mark that it became comic in the end.
Yeah, but it's because the brush mark or the gesture is.
I think the sublime became quite comic in the end. I think abstract expressionists pushed it. I mean, I think sort of Rothko and Barnett Newman and Clifford Still pushed it to the point where I see their work as being quite comic. When I stand in front of it, I can't feel anything greatly sublime from a Rothko, really. It just looks like, at one particular moment in time, people thought that idea of painting was so new and so fresh that they could read all these ideas into it. Fundamentally, 50 years later, it looks a bit simple and dull.
I think what's also it's that kind of cliche, isn't it, whereby a lot of people wanted to read into the kind of physical impasto gesture of, say, Takumi, this idea that somehow the artist is ripping out your guts, but what's on the canvas is directly the artist's inner self. And of course, we now know that that's kind of stupid, and it is, in fact, what the impasto mark is only a representation of one's feeling or one's thought. It can only be a representation. I think this is the key word for all of us. Representation being absolutely paramount in our work, in that we recognise in painting that painting is framed by its language in relation to other visual languages, which includes contemporary, for example, the internet, reproduction. And I think that we are kind of knowing, we are very knowing in that, not us three, but I think the world, all of us in this room, are very knowing about the idea that representation places us in the world, rather than us walking around like raw, open wounds.
By representation, you mean images?
I mean
photography, or
I mean yes, I do mean representation of images, but I also mean it as a language. Okay, so that I don't just mean like a picture, like a representational picture. I mean it's a kind of agency. So between what's inside the person and what's being made, there is an agency, an operation, a moment that something that happens, and that something is in fact the representation. It's the language of representation.
As in the phenomenology of the physical event of making the work.
I think that's something slightly different. I think what I'm trying to say is that we come to the world through representation and language. That's my claim. But it frames us, it shapes who we are. It shapes the people, how we think, how we grow up, how we interact with each other, and that somehow, oddly, in a phenomenological sense, there is actually this huge difference.
And do you think these paintings will be read differently in 20 years' time, and do you think they would have been read differently 20 years ago?
Oh, certainly different than 20 years ago. I think people would have complained about the fact they were flat, there was no impasto, and no spinning of my guts, quite in a very literal sense. I don't think.
But they weren't genuine.
They weren't genuine. Is a good word.
Do you think one of the reasons that you make sort of abstract paintings that you've made is to undermine people's expectations of what abstract painting was?
Or? For me, it's interesting because like Mike's talking a lot about representations, and I think I've kind of stood against the idea of representation in that way, because I try and see my work as a manifestation rather than representation. So, the idea that they represent something other than themselves, other than the process. And that process isn't just the physical process of pouring the paint, it's also our history, language, everything that's come to bear to make me want to pour that paint. It's a manifestation of a very complex system onto the surface, and it couldn't be anything else. It couldn't, and that's when you're talking about the digital and the internet and the way in which images are reproduced and sent around on iPhones now. There's something, like in your work, there's something that occurs in the pictorial space that you make that couldn't be anything other than a painting. It has to be that surface, it has to be that kind of dialogue with, even if they're fictional brush marks. And so, in that way there's a representation, but for me it's the idea of manifesting the complexity of the situation.
It's making the thing from framed language.
And so how does that fit in the relationship to the screen, the TV screen, the film screen, the computer screen? Because that's very important in terms of images.
Well, that's just lots of little red, blue, and yellow dots.
But it's something which dominates visual culture now. So why don't you make work which is made on that format?
Because that's completely mathematically controlled, and that's what I'm saying. There's something that occurs when you're in front of a blank canvas, and there's you and it, and something's got to occur in that space. And when I'm talking about Jackson Pollock's stick and that distance, it's not just a physical distance; it's an intellectual difference.
And also for the audience, when the object is finished, the audience come to the work, and there's still a need, I think, for people to come to physical objects in a physical space, even though it may reference the world of the digital or the screen. There's still a need to come to physicality, which keeps us actually physical beings in the world of objects, I think, oddly enough. So it's not a reaction against the screen, but it's a recognition that there's somehow an overlap between the screen and the physical world, and I think painting can occupy that space right now.
There's also, I think, one thing which sort of we've all been very interested in, that is reproduction and the work and how the paintings we've actually made play, taunt the idea of reproduction, taunt the idea of photography and printed material, and how Mike's work looks as if it does use sort of printed symbols, and it uses text and graphic symbols. Keith's used photography and collage in his work to somehow they obviously are objects which you couldn't really reproduce much of your work. So the irony is that you can't just mass produce them, many of them. And again, obviously my paintings, they are all based on photography and lithographs of paintings. That's the starting point, but then what I actually end up with couldn't be made in any other way. You couldn't print it. It would be impossible to mass produce it.
There's a big difference. It's not just the screen and the dissemination of images that's changed. It's also the way we think about repetition and reproduction. So once Warhol would reproduce, but now we think about things as iterations, runs through of the same system. And so in many ways you can see there's a formula at play in one particular show or body of work. And these are different iterations of the same system to see what happens. That's very different to a reproduction, because something different occurs, because it's a different moment when the pen's there, you're in a different place, the world's different. And painting is a place where the now is experienced as well. In reproduction, you're constantly harking back to the past, to some former image that occurred.
I think what we're trying to establish here is why painting is necessary in the world of reproduction. And that's kind of, and I think that's a very complex thing.
I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting that the actual, the idea that when you make a painting, it is of its moment. It was made on a particular day, and you had particularly thought processes on that day, and you're not. I mean, yes, you're harking back to things you've learned in your past life in order to make those decisions. In the way that Picasso, would make a drawing in 30 seconds and actually say, no, that took me a lifetime to make that drawing. But still, fundamentally, it's the notion that the painting captures actually physical events which went on in your studio, and those physical events are trapped on the canvas or panel, and if people come along and read those events, and to some extent have to reenact the processes you went on the studio floor. They have to sort of think, oh, well, you obviously did this first, this second.
Hang on a minute, you could do that in the 1950s with the people we think are kind of hilarious, so where's the difference?
Well, very much the notion of sort of like reproduction. I think that sort of really makes the sort of like a huge difference to it. I mean, I know there was artists in the sort of like 1980s, like sort of Philip Taff, and who else, Mayer Vaisman, who were sort of dealing with abstract expressionism and making sort of like funny plays on Barnett Newman paintings by reproducing them, using rope sort of symbols instead of
as reproductions.
As reproductions. But somehow that seems sort of a rather overly simple take on abstraction, and that we wanted to do something that, yes, wasn't just there to attack abstract expressionism. We didn't feel we needed to attack abstract expressionism. That was done by sort of, as I said, sort of Philip Taffin, Ross Bleckner, or whatever, in the 80s. But we feel we could actually enjoy little bits of it, and maybe like this, you know, like a little bit of Sublime, as long as it didn't go too far, rather than as long as it was rational, and we actually understood that sort of irony existed and the computer exists.
But we all come out of a certain time at art college as well. When I was at art college, it was kind of almost like a cul-de-sac of theory and difficulty, and you know, there was a kind of impossibility of doing anything, kind of nihilism, you know, about painting, without doing anything. And I think that all of us come out of that problem. You know, you couldn't just go in there and blood and thunder and start splatting paint around like Marcus Lucas or something. You had to, you know, consider what you were doing and why you were doing it. And so these are kind of strategies that evolved at college that ended up becoming ways of life and ways of approaching work, I think. And
do you think we're still bound by that, or do you think we've somehow addressed that? We're maybe in a different space.
we've adjusted to it. You know, it's like it's maybe just give up on the idea that there's any, you know, like kind of modernist narrative that you can come up with that's got to sum it all up in some way. You just get, for me, I'm just into the reality of the process, and that's enough.
Do you have more questions?
No, I think Mike is modelling that we think we should
invite the audience. I'm a bit worried this is turning into a pub conversation. And yeah, you're the only one drinking. Maybe we should just all drink, and then it'll be much more fun. But I think also, I just think it would be really great for us, because we haven't rehearsed this at all. It'd be really great for us, for you guys, to help us to continue the talk, really. So really what I'd like to do is ask members of the audience if they have anything they would like to ask, or if they ask us or each other.
Or any statements they'd like to make.
Yeah. David.
Mike, I wanted to ask you, decoration pattern in a sort of disparaging tone. Could you talk about why you feel decoration pattern is a problem?
Did I ever say that?
Yeah.
It was probably in a pub. That doesn't count.
I was interested in the fact that you were talking about decoration and patterns being something seemingly redundant.
You're going to have to frame that maybe in relation to the painting. Do you see the paintings as being decorative and having a pattern?
Well, I was curious that you said it like that. That's why I wanted to bring it up. I wrote it down, and as soon as you said it, I was like, whoa.
It wasn't fair, I was pissed.
I mean, it's now. It's now.
Oh, did I?
In relation to performance.
It was, yeah.
To some extent, you are playing around with using decorators' brushes, using decorators' rollers and decorators' paint to make your work.
Yeah.
You're playing with this idea of decoration.
Yes, absolutely. No, yes, I see what you're saying. Well, basically, you know, I'm quite clear in using those materials, and yes, they are also framing the language of the paintings, but not entirely, because we all know now that we can use any paint we like. It doesn't have to be like, you know, oil paint, because that's supposedly artists' paint. So it doesn't matter what paint we use. But I deliberately choose to use it partly for its association with popular culture, but also, probably more importantly, the fact that I can manipulate it a certain way to do the things I want, so it both flows and is very flat. And also I can layer flat layers, which, although begin to become impasto as flat layers, always visually when you stand 6 foot away look like it could be a screen. It looks flat, so you don't recognise the impasto.
A TV screen.
A TV screen or a computer screen. And I think that for me, artists need to find the medium that best represents the way they want paintings. And of course, you know, these products are made to be decoratively pleasing. And you know, and I want to kind of get a sense of the the sensualness of that, in order to kind of, in relation to what Keith's saying about, you know, the physicality of the paint is being distinctly different from the screen.